Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday, March 28th, and this is the last in our series of GBC Lenten practices. And what I want to invite you to this week is the spiritual practice of generosity. Desmond Tutu writes, "Generosity comes from seeing that everything we have and everything we accomplish comes from God's grace and God's love for us." And so what I want to invite you to this week is to take some time to actually intentionally practice being generous. In Lent, very often we give things up. One of the struggles that is embedded in us is our culture and our wealth and our own sinful nature has really embedded this idea of greed. Now, maybe you don't think of yourself as greedy, but we do tend to hoard things. We do tend to protect ourselves. Often in very unconscious ways. And what we do to address that is not just try to stop being greedy, but we actually try to displace it. There's a writer, David Roseberry, and he writes in his book, Giving Up, how giving to God renews hearts, changes minds, and empowers ministry. He says this, "But if I cannot uproot it," speaking of greed, "I can displace it." Why? Because if greed exists in the mind and the heart, it can be displaced by its positive counterpart, generosity. Indeed, as we will see, greed or covetousness is a vice, and generosity is the only way to displace it. The benefit of a virtue is that once it takes up residence in the human consciousness, it begins to effect change. It rearranges the furniture of our mental and emotional dwelling, and by the time it has finished its redecorating project, there is no room left for greed and covetousness. And so what I'm going to ask you this week is to practice being generous. And by doing that, I mean to intentionally, consciously find ways to give to others. And I would also encourage you to do it in secret. Don't let people know. And generosity is not just giving. It carries this idea of sacrificial giving, right? That's one of the ways you attack at the root of greed in your life is to do something that costs a bit. Something that's a stretch for you. So look for ways. It doesn't have to be money. It could be being generous with time. It could be generous with acceptance. It could be actually being generous in being less critical of others or giving them space to share their ideas, sacrificing something to be generous to others. It's this conscious discipline and act that cuts at the root of greed in our lives and makes space for generosity to grow instead of greed in our heart. Jesus said, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And I think that's important. What you're doing in generosity is you're actually taking your treasure and putting it with someone else, which means you're beginning to value them and treasure them, just as God does. So find some ways. Don't overwhelm yourself. Maybe do one a day. Maybe do 3 this week. Maybe do 1. But take the time to consciously cultivate a practice of generosity and follow that through this week. Love you guys. Look forward to celebrating with you next week on Resurrection Sunday. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.